Thank you, Kea. Basically, there were two myths that we wanted to talk about. One was the myth that Kea was talking about, the myth that emerging economies, developing countries are not doing anything on climate change. The other myth is one that has come up specifically in the context of this meeting. And that myth has been about, well, the developing countries don't want to talk about finance in the G20. They don't want to talk about this climate finance thing that came up by leadership of President Obama from the leaders meeting in the Major Economies Forum back in July. They don't want to talk about it. And that's why we can't get a result. And that myth, I think, is as untrue as the myth that developing countries are not doing anything. Why is that myth untrue? Well, first of all, it would be very, very strange that developing countries would not want to talk about finance. I mean, the overall parameters, the overall content of the deal that needs to be made is a deal that's built on trust between developed and developing countries. That's the big thing that we need to achieve before Copenhagen. And what is that trust about? Well, it's about action, commitment from developed countries to reduce their own emissions, to provide the finance that is needed for action in developing countries, and for providing technology. That's what developed countries, that's their side of the deal. The other side of the deal is then what are developing countries committing in terms of their own action, which was what Kea was just talking about, all of that action that is already happening. And why on earth would developing countries not want to use an opportunity to actually talk about one of the three big things that they need from developed countries, the finance? Of course, they have a huge interest in talking about finance. Of course, they have a huge interest in getting to the bottom of getting the commitments from developed countries on finance. So why could there come a myth that the developing countries weren't so interested in discussing this in the G20? Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that the developing countries are very, very keen to see the climate agreement being reached in the Climate Change Convention framework. They see, and I think they are right, they see the Climate Change Convention and the Kyoto Protocol as the instruments that the world has agreed to deal with climate change. And they see them as the place where the next step in a global climate change regime, global climate change agreement, also needs to happen. Therefore, they're a bit concerned with all sorts of other discussions happening in other forums because they need to be translated into something that is directly relevant for an agreement to be reached in the UN Convention on Climate Change framework by this Copenhagen in December. They have already accepted one other set of forums that discuss climate change. These are the Major Economies forums that were set up by President Obama last year, and they are meeting every month to discuss all of these issues in a setting of 17 countries, the 17 biggest emitters. That forum, the developing countries have already accepted as a place where we can get some political momentum, some discussion going, in addition to what we do in the UNFCCC. And now the developed countries are coming asking them to take yet another forum, namely the G20, to also discuss some of the same things in that third forum, and that's where they began to get, what's happening here? Why are we doing all this? Is this because the developed countries don't want to have the discussion in the UNFCCC? Is it because they don't want to have the big group of developing countries in the discussion? Because in the UNFCCC we have 130 or so developing countries. In this setting we have about 10. Is that the reason? Why is it that this is happening? And that made them feel a little bit concerned. There's also one more thing which I believe is important, and that is by taking the finance discussion into G20, what the developed countries are also doing is to take only one of the building blocks, only one set of their commitments, and discuss that. And how can you see whether you can do the deal on the basis of one of their commitments only? Because the developing countries need from the rich countries both the emission reductions at home, they need the finance, and they need the technology deal. And in this forum you can only discuss one of them. Whereas in the UNFCCC, you can discuss them all at the same time. You can make the deal with all the elements of it at the same time and see what's moving. And also in the MEF, you can do the same. So I hope that this meeting in G20 will continue what we've seen coming out of the MEF meeting, out of the UN meeting, and there have been some other many bilateral meetings between ministers, which seems to be a sense that we are moving, that things are opening, that doors are opening to new discussions, that we are willing to actually find a compromise. And I hope that this meeting and the communique coming out of that will actually give us even more basis for that hope that we're moving in the right direction.